The river smelled like damp clay and dying roots, a scent Eloise Mercer had come to recognize as both lifeblood and warning. It was the kind of morning where the sun rose like a branding iron, slow and burning, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods that bordered the Red Butte River. The trees whispered in a wind that didn't cool, only carried dust and silence. The silence wasn't peace, not out here. It was watchful, like something just out of sight was listening. She moved through it like a ghost of herself, boots brushing aside the prairie grass, worn basket swinging at her hip. Her dress clung to her legs with sweat already gathering at the nape of her neck. In her right hand, she carried her father's old skinning knife, dull from use and cleaned too many times with lye. The blade still held its edge, same as her. 3 winters ago, she'd buried Thomas on a frostbit hill under hard, stubborn ground. The fever had taken their infant son a day before, their little girl 2 nights after. The grief had burned deep, but Eloise didn't burn away. She froze. She had not left since. She did not mourn publicly. She did not return east. She did not crumble. She stayed. Eloise Mercer lived alone on 160 acres of hard-won Texas dirt, just outside the borders of Dry Creek Hollow. The others called it cursed land, too close to the river. Too close to where the Lakota had ridden before the lines were drawn on maps that didn't ask permission. But Eloise had made peace with the river, with the groves, with the mesquite, and their twisting shade. This morning, she was headed to check the fishing lines she had tied off under the bend near Devil's Reach, a place where the river narrowed and twisted like it was trying to remember itself. The air buzzed with cicadas, dry and frantic. The dirt cracked beneath her soles. Somewhere overhead, a hawk screamed. One long, sharp note that made her stop walking and listen. It didn't feel right. Not the wind. Not the weight of the sky pressing down like it meant to bury her whole. She kept walking. By the time she reached the riverbank, her shirt was soaked at the back, and sweat had gathered at her collarbone. She crouched to check the traps. A pair of catfish, fat and glistening with river mud, hung limp in the twine net. She grunted and pulled them free, gutting one with practiced fingers, wiping the blade on her apron. That's when she heard it. A horse's shrill cry. Not near, but not far enough to ignore. Eloise straightened, the sun blazing in her eyes as she looked across the water. Downstream, just beyond the far cottonwoods, a rider approached the river's edge. The way the horse moved, smooth, swift, like a dance with the wind, it didn't belong to any settler's stock. Not from Dry Creek Hollow. Painted markings across the pony's flank. Red and black stripes beneath the saddle line. War paint. Her blood chilled. The rider slid off the horse and led it into the water. Young, slim in the shoulders, the kind of slim that meant not yet full grown. He moved like he was born on a saddle. She ducked lower, behind a rise in the bank, heart hammering beneath her dress. Her rifle was back in the cabin, a mistake she would not make again. The knife in her hand felt like a paper scrap against distance and speed. Then the boy's horse whinnied, high and startled, jerking the reins from his grasp. It scrambled backward toward dry ground. He didn't. The boy stumbled, sank. For a heartbeat, she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Then it hit her. Quicksand. The rains had shifted the riverbed in recent weeks, turning familiar ground into traps. Now the boy, the young warrior, was waist-deep and flailing. Mud churned around him like a living thing, swallowing him with every twitch. Eloise should have turned away. He was Lakota, a people who had raided wagons, who had scalped men and taken girls. That's what the stories said. That's what Dry Creek Hollow said. Her husband had carried a rifle because of them. But as she crouched behind the bramble and watched his arms flail, his mouth open in a voiceless cry, something else spoke inside her. Not mercy, not madness, just refusal. She would not watch another person die. Not today. She dropped the fish and stood. She tore the hem from her apron, yanked branches down from the cottonwoods. Her hands moved faster than her mind, fingers lashing sticks with strips of cloth, building a makeshift lifeline. She stepped out from the cover and shouted, "Stop struggling!" Her voice cracked over the water like a whip. The boy's head snapped toward her, his dark eyes wide. He froze. Whether from fear or surprise, she couldn't say. They stared across the river, two people whose ancestors had only ever known blood. He didn't move. "Hold on," she shouted. "I'm going to throw something to you." She waded in, carefully, deliberately, the water cool but pushing hard against her knees. The riverbed beneath her boots shifted like loose grain. She said a silent prayer and threw the rope. He caught it. Her arms strained as she pulled, but it wasn't enough. The suction held him. His legs were trapped like the earth had him by the ankles. She needed more. Then she looked at the horse, his pony. Still standing nearby, reins dragging. "Don't pull," she cried. "Just lean back. Keep your weight spread." She moved for the horse. Its eyes rolled, but it didn't bolt. She spoke to it in low tones, like she would have spoken to her husband's old gelding back when they used to ride together. Slowly, she gripped the reins, led it to the rope, and tied it to the saddle horn. "On 3, she said, not knowing if he'd understand. 1, 2. She slapped the horse's flank. The animal surged forward. The rope snapped taut. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, inch by inch, the boy began to rise. The riverbed released him like it was giving up on its meal. His torso came free, then his hips. His legs were last, thick with mud, trembling. Then he was on solid ground, panting, covered in muck, alive. She collapsed onto her side, breath rasping in her throat. Across the river, the boy stood slowly, his eyes locked on hers. He touched his chest. Said a word, one word, in a language she didn't know. But the way he said it, it was a name. Chaska. She touched her own chest. Eloise. He nodded, tried her name, fumbled it, but smiled. He reached into the pouch at his hip and pulled something wrapped in soft deer hide. He tossed it underhand, gently. She caught it. Inside, a turquoise bear, carved smooth and strung on a leather cord. She stared at it, stunned. He pointed to it, then to her, then pressed his hand to his heart. He gave it to her, his gratitude, his trust. And then, without a word more, he turned, mounted his pony, and vanished into the trees. She stood there, the bear in her hand, the sun burning overhead, the river whispering secrets she no longer trusted. That night, she cleaned the pendant and hung it on a nail beside the hearth. The firelight made it gleam like it had breath. She didn't sleep. Not really. The turquoise burned cold against her palm when she held it, as if it wasn't just carved stone, as if it knew what she had done. The next morning, she didn't check her lines. She checked the horizon, because something had changed, and she could feel it coming. The bear felt warm in her hand, and suddenly the wind in the cottonwoods didn't sound so peaceful anymore. They came at dawn, 60 riders cresting the ridge like thunder rolling from heaven, their war paint gleaming like flames. Eloise had risen early, long before the sun crested over the distant line of mesas. She hadn't slept properly, not since the rescue. She'd lain still on her cot, listening to the stillness outside, to the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional distant coyote cry. But nothing unsettled her more than the quiet inside her own chest. The kind that came after something shifted and couldn't be put back where it belonged. The turquoise bear still hung by the hearth, casting shadows on the log wall. Sometimes it caught the flicker of the oil lamp, like it was breathing, watching. She found her eyes drawn to it often, as if it whispered warnings she wasn't ready to hear. She was feeding the chickens when the sound reached her. Distant hooves, too many to count. Not the erratic rhythm of a single rider or a pair of travelers, but the deep and growing thrum of many, moving in unison. Her hands dropped the feed pail. She didn't need to climb the porch to know what she'd see. The first line of riders crested the ridge like a vision from some old dream, proud and terrible. Horses painted with stripes and handprints, riders bare-chested or robed in leather and bone, decorated in eagle feathers, porcupine quills, and sun-faded cloth. Spears and bows gleamed in the hard morning light. They moved with such precision, they might have been one body with 100 hearts. At their center rode a man, unlike the rest, older than the others, his hair long and threaded with silver. A bone breastplate across his chest. His mount, a black stallion with snow-white hooves, moved like shadow over stone. There was no doubt in her mind. This was Chaska's father, Chief Red Elk. The war party halted 50 yards from her cabin, hooves stirring up a dust cloud that hung in the air like a spell. The stillness that followed was heavier than the sound that came before. Eloise stood barefoot in the yard, hands at her sides, lips dry. Her rifle was inside. She didn't reach for it. One of the riders stepped forward from the formation. Chaska. His face was no longer muddy and panicked. It was painted with black lines beneath each eye, a line of red across his brow. He wore a chest piece decorated with blue beads, and a knife she hadn't seen before was strapped across his back. He rode like he had always belonged at the head of warriors. He spoke in English, careful and clear, though the accent bent the words, like river stones. My father, Chief Red Elk of the Lakota, has come to speak with the white woman who saved his son from the hungry earth. Eloise blinked. Her heart beat once, then again. She stepped forward, her voice steadier than her legs. I am honored by his visit, she said, not knowing if that was the right phrase for this moment, but knowing it was the only truth she had. Your son is very brave. The river almost took him, Chaska translated. The chief remained still while his son spoke, only the flicker of his gaze betraying his attention. When Red Elk responded, it was long and measured. Chaska turned back to her. My father says, bravery without wisdom often leads to death. He asks why you risked your life to save an enemy. That word, enemy, hung in the space between them like smoke from a fire that had not yet been lit. Eloise could have offered many reasons. She could have said she didn't think. That instinct moved her feet, that the boy's eyes reminded her of her son's before the fever took him. But none of those things felt right. She lifted her chin and answered plainly. I saw a young man in danger. I couldn't let someone die. Not if I could stop it, Chaska translated. The chief listened. The older man's eyes softened, just barely, then grew sharp again. He responded, his voice deeper this time, formal and echoing over the space between them. Chaska hesitated before translating. He says, in all his years, he has never seen such a thing. White settlers have watched Lakota die without lifting a hand. Some even laugh while they die. He says he does not understand what kind of woman you are. Eloise swallowed. I've lost more than I care to count, she said quietly. And I don't want to be someone who adds to that loss. Chaska looked at her a long time before turning and relaying her words. This time, the response came faster. My father says, among our people a life debt is sacred. To save the life of another is to be bound to them. You saved his son, his blood, his heir. This creates obligation and opportunity. Obligation. The word fell like a stone in her gut. Then, with solemn grace, Red Elk dismounted. He reached into a pouch at his waist, pulled out something wrapped in soft deer hide, and stepped forward alone. The other warriors remained still as stone. When he stood 10 paces from her, he unwrapped the bundle. Inside, a silver armband, etched with turquoise stones, beautiful, weathered, sacred. He extended it. This belonged to his grandmother, Chaska explained softly. She was a peacemaker between warring tribes. He says, maybe you are such a woman too. Eloise's fingers shook as she accepted the gift. The metal was cool, but pulsed with something warm. She nodded, unable to speak. Red Elk lifted his hand, a gesture that seemed both blessing and command. Then he turned and spoke to his warriors. A command passed swiftly through the line. 10 men dismounted and began to make camp, not close, but within sight of her porch. Chaska dismounted last and walked to her, his face softer now. My father gives you 2 choices, he said. You may come live with our people, or you may stay here. But if you stay, you are under our protection. No Lakota warrior will raise hand against you. Eloise looked at the armband, then the turquoise bear, then the horizon. She nodded, barely. I'll need time, she whispered. Chaska relayed it. Red Elk nodded once. Wisdom, he said aloud, in English, then mounted and rode with the others, their departure just as thunderous and terrifying as their arrival. By the time the sun hit the high point of the sky, the war party was gone. Only the 10 silent warriors remained, tending a fire that smelled of cedar and roots, never once speaking to her, never once crossing her fence. That night she sat on her porch, the silver armband tight on her wrist, the bear pendant warm against her chest, and the wind whispering through the trees as if it carried news of the future. That night, the bear and the armband lay beside her oil lamp, glowing like 2 hearts trying to beat in the same chest. The wind changed on the 3rd morning, no longer hot and dry, but restless, like it had somewhere to be. Eloise felt it before she heard a thing, long before hoofbeats or smoke. It stirred through the cottonwoods, flicked the flame on her stovetop, rattled the cornstalks in her garden like they were whispering warnings to each other. It was a traveler's wind, the kind that didn't stop moving, didn't settle, didn't belong. She fed the chickens in silence, aware of every sound, the hens clucking low, the cow shifting in the barn, the river running slower than usual, hushed. The 10 Lakota warriors still kept to their perimeter, quiet shadows just beyond the edge of her field. Not once had they spoken to her, not even Chaska, who remained respectfully distant, sharpening arrows and checking his pony's tack like he was preparing for something none of them had named aloud. She touched the turquoise bear strung around her neck, then looked again to the horizon. 3 days had passed since Chief Red Elk had ridden away, leaving her under tribal protection and with an impossible decision to weigh. But it wasn't just the weight of her future pressing on her this morning. Something else was coming. Chaska was the first to notice the smell, faint, acrid, wrong. He moved to her porch, nodded toward the trees beyond the rise. Smoke, he said simply. They both knew what it meant. Within the hour, the source became visible, a rising black column far to the east, curling above the treetops like a question mark written in soot. Eloise didn't wait. She threw her shawl around her shoulders, strapped the rifle across her saddle, and rode out beside Chaska without a word spoken between them. 2 more warriors, Bearclaw and Silent Wolf, joined at a distance, never close enough to look like an escort, but near enough to become one if needed. They passed through narrow canyons and red-dusted scrublands where the grass grew tall and brittle, signs of abandoned settlements, old root cellars, sagging hitch posts, the windswept bones of fences, marked the land like ghosts refusing to move on. By late afternoon, they reached Dry Creek Hollow, and what they saw made Eloise pull her horse to a full stop. The town looked scorched at the edges. The general store was half burned, its windows black with soot, The blacksmith's roof had collapsed inward. 2 homes stood charred and smoking. Settlers scrambled in every direction, hauling buckets from the well, trying to save what remained. It wasn't an attack. Not yet. It looked more like an accident that had spiraled out of control. But tension hung over the town like a powder keg lit from beneath. A woman with ash streaked across her apron shouted, "Help us!" to no one in particular, flinging another bucket of water onto the smoking frame of the blacksmith shop. Eloise didn't hesitate. She slid from the saddle and handed the reins to Chaska. "Stay close," she whispered. He nodded once. They joined the bucket line. For over 2 hours, they worked side by side with the settlers, farmers, craftsmen, tired women with soot on their cheeks and children clinging to their skirts. No one questioned them at first. In the chaos, they were just another set of hands. But eyes started to linger too long on Chaska. A few whispered, a few flinched. It was after the fires had been mostly beaten back that a man in a soot-covered vest approached them. He looked to be in his 40s, with a full beard peppered with gray and eyes rimmed in exhaustion. "Name's Jeremiah Blackwood," he said, offering a nod rather than a hand. "This is my town. And you are?" "Eloise Mercer," she replied. "We were passing through, saw the smoke, thought we'd lend a hand." He looked her up and down. His gaze shifted to Chaska. His brow furrowed. "Your guide?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," Eloise said evenly. "He knows this land better than anyone." He nodded once. Didn't seem to like it, but didn't challenge it. "Well, I thank you," he said. "Could have been worse if strangers hadn't stepped in." They were offered a place to stay the night, a side alcove in the partially built church. Other families who'd lost homes were bedding down there. It was loud with murmured prayers, crying infants, and the creak of wind against broken timbers. But something about the night didn't sit right. The way the young men stared at them, the way silence fell too quickly when Eloise walked near the supply wagon. Chaska kept his back to a wall and his hand close to the knife at his hip. And then, just after midnight, it happened. She woke to rough hands grabbing her arms, dragging her upright from the floor of the church. Chaska cried out once, but the sound was muffled by the crack of a rifle butt striking flesh. They were bound, wrists tied, gags pushed into their mouths, and dragged through the side of the church into the shadows behind the stable. A group of men stood waiting. Some she recognized from the fire line earlier that day. But the one who stepped forward, tall, lean, face still flushed with youth and fury, carried himself like someone trying to be a man, too fast. "Marcus Blackwood," someone muttered. "The boy's got a plan." Eloise recognized him as Jeremiah's son. Marcus glared at her, his eyes wild. "We're not as dumb as you think," he sneered. "You came here with one of them. You're working with the savages, spying. Getting ready for the raid." Eloise struggled against the rope, but said nothing. Another man, tall, with calloused hands and a scar on his temple, stepped forward with a length of rope. "We'll tie him up good," he said, "then use them to draw the rest in." "That's right," Marcus said, stepping closer. "When the Comanche come to get their boy and their little white whisperer, we'll be waiting." Eloise shook her head, violently, trying to speak through the gag. He didn't listen. "They'll ride in thinking we're weak," Marcus continued, "and we'll light them up from all sides." As he spoke, Eloise saw something flicker in his eyes, a gleam of something deeper than fear, rage, desperation, the kind of madness born not from cruelty, but from a belief that the world owed him something it had taken. They were dragged into the barn and tied to the central post, hands secured behind them. Chaska's eyes met hers, bruised, bleeding, but calm. He nodded once. A silent reassurance. "We'll endure." But her stomach dropped when the barn door creaked open again, and a young boy ran in, panting. Riders, he gasped. Coming in from the west. Lots of them. Marcus's eyes lit up. Perfect, he grinned. He turned back to Eloise. How many, you think? He asked with false sweetness. 50, 60. That's a full damn war party. And they're coming for you. He leaned closer, voice dropping. Which means you're exactly what I thought you were. He turned to the others, voice rising. Get ready. We take positions around the square. When they come for these two, we give them hell. Eloise felt her heart thunder against her ribs. Outside, she could already hear the hooves. Many, fast, coming in waves. She looked at Chaska again. They had to find a way out. Marcus smiled darkly. Good. Let him come. We've got all the kindling we need. Then he lit the lantern. The sun hadn't yet touched its highest point, but everything in Dry Creek Hollow already smelled of powder and sweat. From the edge of the barn where she was tied, Eloise could smell scorched wood, rawhide, and fear. It clung to the rafters like smoke, though no match had yet been struck. The lantern Marcus had lit still swung from a rafter beam, untouched since he'd left. Its weak flame cast a halo over the dirt floor, flickering like it too sensed what was about to unfold. The standoff had begun. Out beyond the church and the scattered remains of the general store, Whetstone Crossing had turned into a stage. The wide, cracked dirt path that led through the center of town had become a war line. On one side, hastily built barricades of hay bales, broken barrels, and stacked planks. On the other, the riders had arrived, painted, solemn, still. 60 warriors by Eloise's count, some younger than Chaska, some old enough to have seen the dead rise from the fields at Sand Creek. They bore spears, rifles, bows, and silence. In the middle of them rode Chief Red Elk, calm as a storm before it breaks. He sat high on his stallion, posture unmoving, the sun catching the feathers in his headdress like a promise. His eyes didn't scan the buildings. They locked on the barn. He knew where his son was. Inside, Eloise strained against the rope, the skin at her wrists already split. The knot hadn't budged. But the beam behind her had rough edges. She turned her wrists subtly, scraping one side at a time. Chaska sat bound across from her, his face bruised but focused. "They'll kill you," she whispered. He didn't flinch. "They'll kill us both." Chaska's gaze lifted. "Not if they remember who we are." Outside, the settlers fanned out behind crates and window slats, most of them boys too young to shave, or old men whose hands shook on the rifle stock. They weren't ready for this. Marcus stood atop a wagon near the church, shouting orders, face flushed with the kind of fire that burned only when mixed with pride and terror. Emma Blackwood, his mother, stood beside the well, apron torn, eyes wide. She didn't hold a gun. She held nothing. She just stared. At the barn, then at the riders, then back again. Something behind her eyes was waking. Jeremiah Blackwood arrived from the outskirts, hat in hand. He took one look at the riders and then at his son, and his face twisted, not in fear, but disappointment so heavy it could split granite. "Marcus," he called, "this ends now." His voice rang like a bell in a church no one had dared to enter. But Marcus turned toward him, chest puffed like a boy playing war. "They came for blood," he shouted. "We'll give it to them, unless they turn around now and ride out like smoke." Chief Red Elk said nothing. He simply lifted one hand. His warriors did not move. Eloise's rope snagged once more against the beam. It loosened. She flexed her wrists gently, feeling the give. In the square, Emma stepped forward. "You told me they killed our stock, Marcus," she said. "You told me they threatened the town, but the only one holding a woman and a boy prisoner is you." Gasps rippled through the settlers. Marcus flushed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know what I see," she said, "and I know who saved my neighbor's child during the fire. That wasn't you. That was her. Emma pointed to the barn. To Eloise Mercer. The crowd stirred. Inside, Eloise closed her eyes. Her hands slipped free. She didn't wait. She scrambled to Chaska, whose eyes widened. "Turn," she whispered. He did. She untied his hands with trembling fingers. Outside, Marcus shouted, "She's got them loose!" Gunfire cracked. One shot. Then silence. Emma Blackwood had fired into the air. The echo rolled across the valley like thunder. "You'll lower your weapons," she said calmly, "or I'll lower you." The rifle shook in her hands, but her voice didn't. For a moment, no one moved. Then Jeremiah stepped to her side. Then another man. Then a woman holding a child. One by one, they laid down their arms. Marcus turned in a slow circle and realized no one stood with him anymore. His voice cracked. "They'll take this town from us." "No," Jeremiah said. "We'll give it to them, piece by piece, with peace in return." The barn door creaked open. Chaska stepped out first. Eloise followed. The pendant around her neck caught the sun. The silver armband shone like water in moonlight. Red Elk dismounted and walked forward. No one stopped him. He met her halfway. She held his gaze and lifted the bear. "I never asked to be part of this," she said quietly. He nodded. "But you were chosen." He turned to his son. "You are both chosen." Then he turned to the town. "In my grandmother's time," he said in accented English, "there were women called bridge walkers. They stood between warring clans. They did not carry rifles. They carried memory and word and heart." He turned back to Eloise. "Today my people name her Bridgewalker." The word passed among the Lakota like wind, sacred, slow, reverent. Then Red Elk turned to Marcus. "You may burn buildings," he said, "but you cannot burn truth." He looked back to the line of warriors. He lifted both hands. They lowered their weapons, and the war, which had not yet begun, quietly ended. That evening, as dusk settled, Eloise stood by the old well, the turquoise bear heavy on her chest, when Chaska approached and said, "There will be more towns, more trouble. Will you ride with us when the time comes?" The clouds rolled in without thunder, low and heavy, like the sky had forgotten how to breathe. Eloise stood in the garden behind her cabin, hands deep in the earth. The scent of turned soil clinging to her palms. The beans had begun to vine along the twine she'd strung weeks ago, reaching for the faint sun that now seemed reluctant to shine. Somewhere behind her, the river flowed slow and thick, its song dulled by the press of coming rain. She welcomed the quiet, for the first time in days. The town had not burned. The Lakota had not fired a single arrow. The rifles once readied in shaking hands had been lowered, not by command, but by a soft unraveling of fear that began with a woman's voice and ended with a shared breath beneath the open sky. Still, the tension had not vanished. It had simply receded, like the water line before a flood. Jeremiah Blackwood had come to the cabin at dawn 2 days earlier. He had ridden alone. No weapon, no demand. He stood at the fence line and removed his hat. "You were right," he said. Eloise didn't ask what he meant. She only poured him coffee and listened as he apologized in his own way, with silence, a worn hand around the mug, and eyes that had seen too much. Now, as the clouds gathered, she waited for Chaska's return. He had gone with 2 of the younger warriors to scout south of Red Mesa Ridge, where rumors of raiders had trickled up the valley. Not Lakota, not settlers either. Men who rode without tribe or purpose, taking whatever the wind had left behind. The kind who stirred the bloodiest chapters of memory. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned when she heard hooves approaching. Her breath caught, just a little, before she even saw him. Then there he was, Chaska, dust-covered and lean, his hair tied back, a fresh cut along his cheekbone. He dismounted slowly. "They're close," he said without preamble. 2 days' ride. Maybe less. Eloise led him to the porch, poured water into a tin cup. "Settlers?" she asked. He shook his head. "No colors. No language. They ride like jackals." She nodded, tension tightening her shoulders. The bear pendant felt heavier today. That afternoon, the 10 Lakota who had remained as guardians reassembled under Red Elk's orders. They lit no signal fires. They moved without ceremony, preparing not for war, but for witness. Their position near Eloise's land meant something now, not only protection, but declaration. This ground, once seen as cursed or forgotten, had become something else. A boundary, a promise. As twilight fell, a rider approached from the southern trail, not a scout, not one of theirs. He carried a white cloth in his hand, but his face was shaded by a wide-brimmed hat and a coat dusted red by long miles. Chaska stepped forward, hand near his blade. Eloise stood beside him, eyes narrowed. The man dismounted. He was tall, narrow-hipped, with fingers stained from tobacco and a gait that suggested he hadn't walked in weeks. "I'm looking for safe land," he said. "Folks down the ridge say there's a woman up here what stands between guns." Eloise studied him. His eyes were pale and flat. A man who watched before speaking. Not reckless, worse, calculated. She said nothing. He stepped forward. "My name's Dalton Crow. I used to ride with Colonel Brenham's company, for the war ended and the flags came down. Now I ride with men who answer to no one, not because we want to take, but because we've already lost." Chaska's jaw tightened. Crow went on. "We heard about your stand at Dry Creek Hollow. We respect it. Means you ain't one of them, and you ain't one of us. You're something in between." Eloise folded her arms. "What do you want, Mr. Crow?" His grin was small, pitying. "Shelter, just for the night. My men don't carry disease, and we'll leave at dawn. But the rains are coming hard, and the pass behind us washed out 2 wagons already." He gestured to the hills. Behind them, 10 to 12 riders had appeared, not charging, but visible, watching. Chaska turned to her, voice low. "They don't ride like men who will leave peacefully." Eloise nodded once. She walked to the fence line and stood tall. "You can make camp near the stream," she said. "No closer. No fires near the tree line. No weapons drawn after dusk." Crow lifted his hat, nodded with a small bow. "You got the word of a former soldier, ma'am." She didn't answer. That night the rain began, slow at first, then a steady rhythm drumming on the cabin roof and the barn's tin siding. The men kept to the rules. No fires were lit. No shots rang out. But Eloise didn't sleep. Inside the cabin, she sat at the hearth, bear pendant in her hands, eyes on the storm. Around midnight, she heard the creak of a board just outside. She stood without sound, reached for the old skinning knife hanging from a nail. Another creak. The door eased open. Chaska stepped in, wet and tense. "They moved closer," he whispered. 3 men left their tents and crept toward the barn. Eloise handed him the rifle. "Then we wake the rest." Within minutes, 6 Lakota had taken silent position at the barn, another 4 at the stream. They didn't make threats. They waited. Just before dawn, Crow emerged, hands visible, coat slick with rain. He looked at Eloise across the muddy yard. "We're moving on," he said. "Didn't sleep. Don't think we're your kind of people." She watched him. He tipped his hat. "Still, I reckon you're something rare. Most folks don't stand between fire and powder unless they're trying to burn themselves." She didn't flinch. "Then don't bring sparks where you ride next." His smile faded. He turned, mounted, and rode. The others followed, quiet as ghosts. As the last horse vanished beyond the ridge, Chaska stepped beside her. They will come back. Not him, maybe, but others. Eloise touched the bear. Then we will stand again. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Because the land beneath her feet had changed, and she would not step back. The first signs of spring came not in bloom, but in wind, warm enough to stir memory, sharp enough to remind you it wasn't quite safe to hope. The trees near the Red Butte River rustled in soft waves, the limbs just beginning to show buds like promises whispered too early. The last patches of snow lingered in the shadows of the northern hills, but the air was different, lighter, tense with what might come next. Eloise stood near the edge of her field, with her sleeves rolled and her hands streaked in soil, planting rows of late potatoes where the frost had finally let go. She could hear the Lakota boys laughing near the water, trying to skip stones across the creek's bend. Not long ago, those sounds would have startled her. Now they folded into the rhythm of her day, like bird calls and wind chimes. But her thoughts were not on laughter. She was thinking of the letter that arrived 2 days prior, a message brought by an old stagecoach runner who hadn't seen this stretch of land in months. He had handed it to her with 2 fingers and a nervous smile. "Name's misspelled, but I reckon it's meant for you," he'd said. She'd read it on the porch, alone, scrawled in sharp, almost angry ink, "Mrs. Mercer. The circuit judge is riding through Dry Creek Hollow come the 3rd Sunday of April. He will be settling land disputes and claims. Some folks have raised concern about the legality of your homestead, considering who surrounds it. You may want to prepare a statement. J. Blackwood." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it was a warning, and it reminded her that while peace had bloomed on her land like the first wild flowers of the season, the wider world had not changed so quickly. This chapter of her life, her place between 2 nations, between war cries and lullabies, was about to be tested by ink, gavel, and the sharp edge of law. The judge would arrive in 8 days. Chaska knew what it meant the moment she showed him the letter. He had stared at it, then at her, then folded it in half and slid it beneath a stone beside the hearth. "They will try to erase this," he had said. "Not with fire this time, but with paper." Now, as she planted and the boys laughed and the sun finally felt kind again, Eloise knew it was time to decide how she would face it. Not with begging, not with apologies, but with truth. That night, she lit a lamp and pulled out her husband's old ledger, pages yellowed with age, receipts for oats, cattle, flour, letters from the army, birth certificates, the deed, or what passed for one, from when they'd first claimed the land 15 years ago, in the spring of 1872. But it was the letter she'd written, the one she hadn't shown anyone, that she reached for now. To the judge. She had rewritten it 4 times. Each time shorter, sharper, until only what mattered remained. She read it aloud to the fire like a confession. "I did not build this place with timber and stone alone, but with kindness and blood. I have fed the hungry, defended the innocent, and stood between death and misunderstanding more times than I care to count. If law sees me as less because of who now rides beside me, then the law is blind, and I will not yield." Eloise Wren Mercer. The next morning, Red Elk arrived with 3 elders and 2 women from a distant Lakota band. Word had spread. The woman who stood between nations would soon be judged by one. They offered to walk with her when the day came, not to threaten, to witness. "It is the old way," Red Elk said. "Where there is doubt, we do not speak alone. We speak in the presence of memory." So they prepared, quietly. No weapons, no shouting, just presence. 8 days later, the town of Dry Creek Hollow looked different. As flags hung outside windows, horses lined fences. The church bell had been polished, A red, white, and blue sash hung from the judge's wagon, absurd against the dust and cracked timbers of the settlement. Jeremiah Blackwood met her at the outskirts. "I warned you," he said gently. Eloise looked at him, her eyes steady. "I didn't come for warnings. I came for justice." Inside the church, the pews were filled with settlers, many of whom she had helped during the fire. Others who had once looked through her as if she were smoke. At the back stood the Lakota, silent, unmoving, Chaska among them, Red Elk, the women in ceremonial beadwork, the boys who'd once feared the river, but now carried bows like they carried breath. Judge Hollis was a thin man with a thick mustache and colder eyes than the snowmelt rivers. He looked over his spectacles at her, then at the folded paper in his hand. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "it seems your claim is in dispute." "No," Eloise replied. "My claim is being questioned, not by the law, but by those who don't wish to share the land they never truly owned." A ripple passed through the crowd. The judge lifted an eyebrow. "Careful, ma'am." She stepped forward, the letter trembling only slightly in her hand. "I have the original deed, signed by my husband, filed with the office in Montgomery Parish. I have proof of taxes paid, livestock raised, crops sold. But that's not the measure that matters." He tilted his head. "Then what is, in your view?" Eloise looked behind her, at Red Elk, at Emma Blackwood, at the boys by the door. This land remembers who bled for it, who healed on it, who taught its children to read, who stood still when others fled. She turned back. "If your law cannot see that, then it isn't law. It is cowardice in paper skin." Silence. Then Red Elk stepped forward. He said nothing, simply placed a bundle at the judge's feet, tobacco wrapped in cloth, an offering of peace. Witness. The judge stared at it. Then slowly he folded the letter. "No ruling today," he said. "I will consider the testimony and the documents. I suggest the town consider its conscience." He stood, without fanfare, without a gavel, just silence. The crowd parted as he left. Outside, the wind had changed again. This time it carried no threat. Just the faint sound of horse hooves, fading, and the echo of a woman's voice that would not be erased. And so it is, when the wind settles and the dust lies down, a kind of stillness rises that don't belong to silence, but to remembrance, like the hush after a hymn ends in an old wooden chapel whose windows never quite close. The land holds what the people forget, and the trees, though they do not speak, remember the names of those who touched their roots with care. The smell of cornbread baking in the stove, the glint of a silver armband catching morning sun, the gentle press of a horse's nose against a weathered palm. These are things that linger long after the riders have moved on. Somewhere along the Red Butte River, the turquoise bear still swings gently on a woman's chest, warmed by the heart that earned its weight. The barn creaks not from age, but from stories it now carries like a saddle bears its rider, strong and silent. There are boot prints near the stream that have not washed away, and a braided strand of horsehair tied to a willow branch that no one dares untangle. The church bell, once silent through fire and fear, now rings on Sundays again, and when it tolls, folks sit a little straighter, because they know someone stood once where it seemed no one ever would. The land, if it could sigh, would do so now, and it would smell of tobacco offerings, river clay, and wild onions growing near the edge of what used to be called the disputed ridge. Justice came not in thunder or ink, but in the steady heartbeat of a woman who did not leave, who held her ground, not with rage, but with patience, like how the moon waits for the tide to return. The Lakota boys still skip stones when spring breaks, and sometimes, when the water's low, they find an old horseshoe buried in the mud, rusted but whole. That's how honor feels, perhaps. forgotten for a spell. But never quite destroyed. Emma Blackwood now bakes 2 loaves instead of 1, and sends one downriver each week, wrapped in cloth with stitched initials that once meant judgment, but now mean grace. The town doesn't speak of the standoff much, but they keep the path to Eloise's cabin clear, and someone always replaces the wildflowers on the post by her gate. There's a new sign outside the town hall, hand-carved, simple, that reads, Bridgewalker Trail, and the judge, when he rides through, tips his hat and says little, but stays a night longer than he used to. Some truths, they say, don't need proving, just preserving. There are children growing up now who don't ask what side of the river someone comes from. They just ask if they know how to fish, or how to mend fence, or tell stories beneath a cottonwood tree when the stars come out early. Because justice, when it's earned, seeps deep into the ground and grows back strong through every cracked board and weather-beaten door. And maybe that's the legacy of a woman who was never looking to make history, only to survive it with her soul intact. You can still hear the wind whistle through the eaves of her home, carrying laughter, apology, a song in a language not taught in schools, and a name whispered softly by those who once forgot. It mattered. The truth doesn't need an audience, just a keeper. The old mule still knows the path from the stream to the porch, and he walks it like he always has, slow and sure. The firewood stack is always just high enough. The lamp burns low, but steady. If you listen close, you can still hear the sound of hooves fading into twilight, not in retreat, but in peace. And when you walk that land, if you ever do, leave a stone at the edge of the well or a feather on the gate, not as a monument, but as a promise, that you still believe there's honor in standing firm without a rifle, redemption in reaching a hand instead of raising a fist, and that sometimes it takes just one forgotten woman to teach a whole town how to remember itself. If this story reached you like a wind you didn't expect, leave a sign in the dust before you go. A kind word, a nod, a memory. And if your heart feels a little heavier and a little warmer, like maybe it's remembered something it thought it lost, then consider staying a while longer. Subscribe to our channel if you'd like to hear the next tale whispered slow and low, like dusk across the plains. And as for tonight, may your lantern burn soft, your porch be quiet, and your soul find the peace of a town that finally heard the truth it tried so long to bury.